Tonight we begin our series of interviews with candidates this year for Suffolk County District Attorney. Our guest is a state representative for parts of Dorchester and Roxbury. Before that, he was also an assistant district attorney who prosecuted gun crimes. We'd like to welcome Evandro Carvalho.
Thank you, Chris. It's always a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for being in and yourself for the service that you do for our communities.
Thank you for being with us. I want to talk about your decision because before you decided to run for DA, you were thinking of running for state senator.
Yes.
And the way you're going back to your previous world in a DA's office, why did you want to do that?
For me, being a public service is serving in the best capacity that I can. To serve, where can I best help the people, right? And honestly, I haven't, particularly today in the environment that we live in, whether it's in Boston or other parts of the country or in Suffolk County, there is, I believe, no other office that has the impact that he has in people's daily lives, whether they live in Roxbury or in Revere and Winthrop. So to me, I believe that in terms of the skills and the experiences that I've had as an individual who lives in Uplands Corners, growing, who has a 2-year-old daughter, someone that grew up in Dorchester, went to Madison Park High School, and to have the benefit of going to college at UMass Amherst and then go to Howard University School of Law and come back and be a prosecutor, as you mentioned. I just think that in terms of the experiences I've had, this is the most important office for our community. This is where I feel like my skills and my experience can better help the community.
Back when you were prosecuting people for gun offenses, you could have done it just by formula, but you must have noticed a lot of the circumstances that were tied into what people were doing when they made mistakes. What did you learn from that?
I noticed, particularly as you mentioned, while prosecuting guns, is that people, people enter the criminal justice system, particularly when they get arrested for gun or other crimes. They come with a particular set of circumstances. Often in our communities, people are poor. They are dropped out of high school, particularly with dealing with guns, as you were talking about. I felt that the system was often inadequate in terms of dealing with individuals, because the DA role and the prosecutor role has been, in my mind at least, one of reserve, one of reaction. So wait till individuals get into the system and see what you can do and try to do the best you can. But I think that the DA's role as a whole has to be a lot more proactive, a lot more dealing with individuals, particularly when you're talking about young people with guns. What is it happening in the community that are leading them to guns? And I think that's where the role of the prosecutor needs to go.
I know you're not running against the current DA because he's not running again, but he and many other DAs in Massachusetts were very much against rolling back on mandatory sentencing for some nonviolent crimes. You are on the other end of the spectrum on that. Why are you right and they don't quite match you on that?
One thing that we know, I think, broadly speaking, in terms of how crime and justice has worked over the past 30 years, particularly related to the war on drugs, is that in general, prosecutors have taken the approach that you punish people, you put them in jail for long period of times, and hopefully you seek justice and the community is safer. What we've shown, though, is what the data shows, though, that's not the case, right? That not only do, particularly when you take, so-called drug dealers from the community, that's just another pipe, another feeder for someone else to come in and replace them. And secondly, the way that we have treated the mandatory minimums, particularly, have had, unfortunately, some racial disparities in terms of the application of mandatory minimums. So for me, it's just how do we move forward in terms of thinking about drug dealers, thinking about public safety, thinking about, particularly when you're dealing with, the opiate crime abuse that's happening around. People, 5 to 6 people die every day in Massachusetts from opiate abuse. So when you're talking about mandatory, because it's mandatory, because people have to do that time, and that depending on the circumstances, it doesn't take into consideration, particularly oftentimes people that are abusing the drug, particularly now with opiate. They also may have some to sell to use, right? So do we want that person that's a drug addict or dealing with mental health issues, or even a young man that has a circumstance particularly unique in our communities, whether again it's poverty, whether it's lack of school, do we just want to say they fit into this mandatory minimum, so let's just lock them up for that period of time? Or do we want to say, let's look at the circumstances, let's see if this person has an addiction, let's let the judge decide, right? Ultimately, too, the discretion in terms of the judge, look at the whole person, look at the circumstances, and then make a decision. And sometimes it'll be a drug dealer that you do want to go to prison for a while. But oftentimes, people that are dealing at the lower level that are not necessarily, impact players or whatever the police sometimes call, they also get grabbed into that system, and then they have to do the mandatory minimum. They're not getting treatment in jail. They're not getting training. If they drop out of school, they're not getting the adequate education that they need. So at the crux of this is what is the role of the prosecutor? Is it just to send to jail for as long as possible, or to look at the circumstances and be fair and think of the individual and think about the community and how can the prosecutor better effect change?
This has been the news. We're talking with State Representative Evandro Carvalho, candidate for Suffolk County District Attorney. Evandro, I want to ask you about one of the problems we've heard about in recent years, survivors of violent crimes who say that they want to have a better experience when they're being questioned by police, and I guess eventually prosecutors come into this as well. What do you see your role as a DA in making that work better?
So as I mentioned earlier, so the DA has to think about how to serve the public, right? So, and unfortunately, particularly some of the stories I've heard is, even dealing with the police, is that, the survivors of homicide or witnesses or family members are not getting the adequate, help that they need, whether it's a return phone call, whether one of the issues, for instance, that I'm able to help through the state is when someone is killed in your family, if you have the need you need help to bury that person, that the state should help as well, right? So for me, it's about thinking about how the DA plays a role, not just in the courtroom, but like dealing with trauma, dealing with substance abuse, dealing with survivors of homicide, and particularly in the city of Boston, dealing with a lot of unresolved homicides. So there's a climate of distrust with the system, not just the police, the system as a whole, particularly with communities of color where crimes are not being solved, whether it's shootings, whether it's actual homicides. So the DA has to try to be more impactful, listen to the needs of the community and see how to best resolve those issues. But again, at the crux, I think, of this race is to talk about what is it that the DA should be doing, right? And part of, obviously this is early on in the campaign, but part of my strategy is to do just that. We all have opinions in terms of what we think should happen, but at the crux is to try to listen. What is the role of the prosecutor and intersecting with victims, police, witnesses, survivors, even defendants? What is it that the DA could be doing better? And that's what the future should be talking about.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Candidate for Suffolk County DA, State Representative Evandro Carvalho. New exposure for early music from Boston up ahead, and we'll talk about performances and a series of recordings by the Handel and Haydn Society.